All right, today we are jumping into a theological detective story, and I mean a high-stakes one, straight out of the 5th century. We're talking emperors, bishops, even riots in the streets, all centered on one of the deepest questions in Christianity. A question that, believe it or not, almost ripped the church and the entire Roman Empire right in two.
So after the Council of Nicaea in 325, the church finally settled it. Jesus is fully God. Great, case closed, right? Well, not exactly. That answer opened up an even thornier question. If Jesus is 100% God and 100% man, how on earth does that actually work? How do those two realities exist in just one person? It sounds super abstract, but getting the answer wrong, well, it threatened the very idea of salvation itself.
So, here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with that big question that kicked this whole thing off. Then we'll meet the man at the center of it all, Eutyches, and unpack his very controversial answer. We'll see how his idea fits on a spectrum of other heresies, and then follow the incredible historical drama, from a violent robber council all the way to the landmark Council of Chalcedon. And finally, we'll look at the official definition they came up with, and, most importantly, explore why this ancient fight still matters so much for faith today.
Yeah, so the Council of Nicaea might have shut the door on Arianism by declaring Christ as truly God, but in doing so, it basically opened a theological Pandora's box. Now, all the smartest minds in the church had to figure out the mechanics of it. How do the divine and the human relate in Jesus? Is one nature in charge? Are they kind of separate? Or do they get all mixed together? And you have to understand, this was not just some academic debate for theologians. The Byzantine Empire was a deeply religious world. Theological unity was seen as absolutely essential for holding the empire together. So disagreement over the nature of Christ wasn't just a disagreement. It could lead to riots, political breakdowns, and massive schisms. The stakes just could not have been higher.
Okay, so into this intense environment steps a man named Eutyches. He was an influential archimandrite, basically the head of a big monastery in Constantinople. Now, he was fiercely opposed to a teaching called Nestorianism, which he believed separated Christ's two natures too much, almost making Jesus sound like two people sharing one body. So in his passion to correct that, Eutyches swung the pendulum way to the other extreme.
And this is the heart of his idea. Eutyches basically said that after the Incarnation, when God became man, the two natures, divine and human, they merged into one. But here's the key. It wasn't a 50-50 blend, not even close. In his view, the divine nature was so overwhelmingly powerful that it just absorbed the human nature, creating this new, single, hybrid nature. His opponents came up with this brilliant metaphor to explain what was wrong with his idea. They said Eutychianism is like taking a single drop of honey and letting it fall into the ocean. I mean, is the honey technically still there? Yeah, somewhere, but it's completely dissolved, its properties totally lost in the massive ocean. And that was the problem. Christ's humanity, that little drop of honey, was just lost in the vast ocean of his divinity.
Now, to really get a handle on what Eutyches was saying, it helps to see it as part of a whole spectrum of ideas the church was trying to navigate. It was basically a theological Goldilocks problem. One heresy was too separate, another was too mixed, and a third was incomplete. The orthodox position had to be just right there in the middle. So here's how they all stack up. You've got Nestorianism on one side, which overemphasized the distinction so much it almost sounded like two persons. Then you have Eutyches reacting against that, who overemphasized the unity by mushing them together. And then there was an earlier idea, Apollinarianism, which kind of cheated by saying Jesus had a human body but a divine mind, which of course means he wasn't fully human. Let's make this even simpler. Think of it like ice cream. Nestorianism is like you've got a scoop of chocolate and a scoop of vanilla sitting side by side in a bowl. They're in the same bowl, but they're still two distinct scoops. Eutychianism is like taking those two scoops, throwing them in a blender, and hitting puree. You end up with a single, new swirl flavor. It's not just chocolate anymore, and it's not just vanilla. It's something else entirely.
So as you can probably imagine, this theological debate did not stay in the classroom. It exploded into a full-blown political war. Seriously, the next few years were this chaotic whirlwind of church councils, backstabbing condemnations, and imperial power plays that would literally decide the future of Christianity.
And things escalated so quickly. First, in 448, Eutyches gets condemned by his boss, Patriarch Flavian. But Eutyches had friends in high places. So the next year, a new council is called at Ephesus, but it was an absolute sham. It was run by intimidation, with imperial troops literally threatening bishops. They cleared Eutyches' name and condemned Flavian.
It was such a disaster that a new, legitimate council had to be called just 2 years later at Chalcedon to clean up the mess. Pope Leo the Great, all the way over in Rome, was absolutely furious when he heard what happened. His representatives were ignored, his letters were never even read, and the whole thing was decided by brute force. He gave the council its infamous nickname, the Latrocinium, which is Latin for the Robber Council, or the Synod of Robbers, and that name has stuck ever since.
You see, that letter the Robber Council refused to read? That was Pope Leo's tome to Flavian, and it was a theological masterpiece. It laid out the Orthodox position with incredible precision, condemning the Nestorians for separating the natures on one hand and Eutyches for confusing them on the other. It became the rallying cry and the blueprint for what was about to happen next.
So, with a new emperor on the throne who wanted to fix things, a new council was called in 451 in the city of Chalcedon, and its mission was crystal clear: fix the disaster from the Robber Council and come up with a final, definitive, universally accepted statement on who Jesus Christ is.
And the scale of this thing was just immense. We're talking around 600 bishops showed up. It was one of the biggest church gatherings in history. The entire Christian world was basically holding its breath. And when Pope Leo's tome was finally read out loud to the assembly, the bishops famously shouted, "Peter has spoken through Leo."
And this is the core of what they came up with: the Chalcedonian definition. It's a work of art, really, a masterpiece of theological balance. Just look at the language. The first two phrases, without confusion, without change, that's a direct shot at Eutyches. The second two, without division, without separation, that's aimed right at Nestorius. It brilliantly affirms that Christ is one single person, but his two natures, divine and human, remain totally distinct and complete within that one person.
So, after all that drama, all that history, all that precise language, why does this matter? Why was it so unbelievably critical to get this definition exactly right? Well, because it cuts to the absolute heart of what Christians believe about salvation. This isn't just playing with words, it's about how salvation is even possible. Just think about it. To be the perfect bridge between us and God, Jesus had to have a foot on both sides. He had to be fully human to truly represent us, and fully God to connect us to the divine. For his death to atone for human sin, he had to die a real human death. But for that sacrifice to have the infinite power to save the entire world, he had to be fully God. If his humanity was just swallowed up, like Eutyches said, then he couldn't really stand in our place. It all falls apart. You need both natures, whole and unmixed. It's absolutely essential. Now, the Council of Chalcedon didn't magically end all the arguments. In fact, it actually led to the first major permanent split in the church. But its definition became the bedrock for what Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestant Christians believe about Jesus. It forces us to stare right into the deepest mystery of the faith, the God who became one of us, to save us, without for a second ceasing to be God. And it just goes to show how a debate from over 1,600 years ago is still defining the very center of Christian belief right now today.